Well, first of all, I want to thank you for welcoming me to this church for this past several weeks. I have really enjoyed it. I love worship. I love preparing for a sermon. I love giving a sermon. I just love being in worship. They knew nothing until the flood came. They knew nothing until the flood came. They knew nothing. Well, I was just saying to a good friend of mine, Anna Bladel, that I just wished that this 4 years election cycle, did you know there's elections happening soon? This 4-year election cycle and the General Conference 4-year cycle were not the same 4 years. There is so much to be aware of, to try to pay attention to, so that we don't wake up one morning finding ourselves in a church, in a denomination we don't recognize, or a country we don't recognize. It's exhausting to care for our immediate family and for our extended family that are our siblings. So it's exhausting to pay attention to all the nooks and crannies of an election cycle and look at legislation and leadership and look at what our denomination stands for. Sometimes I'm so exhausted, there are days all I want to do is to watch those adorable animal videos on Facebook. But the irony of our passage this morning is that the more narrowly we focus on it, the more we end up doing exactly what Jesus says not to do. To worry about the details of the day and the hour of the Son of Man's coming, since that is the precise subject matter. This conversation that Jesus is having with his disciples is part of a much larger conversation that Jesus is having with them, and that conversation concerns the establishment of an international community living under the reign of God. So if we think we have the large visions, can you imagine Jesus talking to the disciples about establishing an international community of living under the reign of love? Isn't that what we want for our country, for a denomination, for all people? Jesus' ministry and the writing of the Gospel of Matthew both took place during the violent, repressive rule of Rome over Judea and neighboring nations that Rome had conquered and incorporated into its empire. The entire conversation challenges the disciples to live as if they believe God and not earthly rulers or empires is sovereign over the earth. In other words, they do not have the last word. The political implications of such faithful living are underscored by where Jesus holds this conversation. According to Matthew, Jesus leaves the temple where he had made various strong statements about the impending destruction of the temple. War was about to break out. They were about to have the temple destroyed. And now he has seated himself on the Mount of Olives. Now the prophet Elijah is associated with the Mount of Olives. Elijah had mobilized a hard-working national resistance against King Ahab, who had turned from covenant obedience to God to allegiance to the foreign gods of his foreign wife. And it's from this politically, they say the gospel's not political, and it's from this politically significant mount that Jesus speaks privately to his closest followers. If I step back and I widen my lens from this lectionary text to the actual context, I notice that it is the disciples, not Jesus, who initiate this conversation about when the temple will be destroyed and what signs of the end of the age will be. Perhaps after 3 years of following Jesus, they were looking for ways to evaluate their ministry's effectiveness and impact in light of the waiting coming. Maybe they were just wondering how much longer they would have to keep up this intensive ministry until massive social change came about. I wonder the same things. Don't you sometimes? The focus on Jesus' conversation is about keeping awake. And it's a metaphor for faithful living in the present. In other words, when the flood happened, some people knew what was going on. They could see signs of it happening. They knew what was going to happen, and they were prepared. Staying awake means being aware of what's happening, doing what you can do with it, and being prepared when it does happen. The staying awake is not about anticipating the coming of the Son of Man or focus towards heaven. No, the focus needs to be towards our neighbors, particularly those who are imprisoned, strangers, sick, and the poor. To be ready is not a matter of predicting particular events, but a matter of connecting to a particular, when did I see you hungry or thirsty? That's the focus of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, that is what is interesting in this very familiar passage in Matthew 25 is that the Son of Man comes to judge the nations, but separates the people of those nations according to whether they've extended uncommon and potentially seditious love towards the least of these. For those who were imprisoned under Roman rule were not the run-of-the-mill burglars. Some were the poor who could not pay their taxes. Still others were men and women who had participated in unsuccessful, popular movements to overthrow Rome. What we would call today political prisoners. And to welcome the stranger, care for the sick, and ensure the survival needs of the poor, and Jesus and his followers were part of the poor, meant a breaking down of the traditional boundaries of who is kin and abolishing the religious laws concerning who is clean and how could they be incorporated into the social and worshiping community. I hear Jesus' message for today to stay awake. Don't keep myself so busy that I'm unaware of what is happening in my city, and my neighbors right in my neighborhood, in my city, in the country, and in the world I live in. Who is my neighbor? What is happening with climate change, with the immigrant and the refugee, right in my own community? Jesus' message says, keep awake. Be ready. Pay attention. Don't be like those who knew nothing until the flood came. First, watch for God's presence. We live with God now. Annie Dillard says in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, says, my left foot, about walking, she says, my left foot says glory, and my right foot says amen. Just as with walking, we can practice spiritual disciplines of paying attention anywhere, anytime, all day long. We don't have to sit down and say some boring prayers, or kneel down, or close our eyes, or stop what we're doing, eating, doing the dishes, sitting in a meeting. We can live in attentive awareness of God. We've got to watch. Next, we are to work. We are to get involved. There's plenty of peacemaking work to be done in our nation among polarized groups who can't seem to progress anywhere. Part of peacemaking is listening. And peacemaking is not peace-mongering. Peacemaking may ruffle feathers. We will find plenty of peacemaking work to be done in the world in dozens of places. including around the globe. And finally, as we watch and as we work, we hold on to hope. The watching, the awareness of God's presence gives us strength to work. And that work, when we're involved in it, leads to hope. Without hope, we will certainly burn out in our work. It can be tiring and frustrating to be a peacemaker in a world that is not peaceful. But the frustrations can lead us to hope, to the knowledge that that only God can bring the order out of disorder or out of hopelessness. Václav Havel, the first post-communist president of Czechoslovakia, wrote about hope in the 1980s while his country was still under communism. And he said these words, "Either we have hope within us or we don't. It's a dimension of the soul. Hope, in this deep and powerful sense, is an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. It is also the hope, above all, which gives us the strength to live and to continually to try new things, even in conditions that seem as hopeless as ours do here and now." His work did come to fruition, at least in part, as will ours in ways even more complete and powerful. And even on days when hope seems distant, when the news coming from near and far seems like nothing but bad news, when our own lives seem in much chaos as the world, the hope is still there. God's promise still assures us that all is not lost, that the day will come, that it does not all rest on my shoulders or on your weary shoulders. About that day and hour, no one knows. But when it comes, nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither will they learn war anymore. Thanks be to God. May it be so.